For those of you who have been living in the real world, I think you'll find that the last few months have been quite an intense time with COVID-19 and lockdown. I work in my day job as a school teacher, and I, along with thousands of other colleagues, have been forced into an online exodus over the last few months. So it's into that situation that this book came to me, Digital Minimalism by Cal Newport. Now, I've got a couple of other of Cal Newport's books. They're very popular, so if you haven't heard of them, this is a little bit of an advert. I'm not being sponsored to say this. This book, So Good They Can't Ignore You, is a terrific book about making the most of each chapter of your career you're in, so that when you get to the next stage, you will be more improved. It's such a great book, beautiful design as well. And then this book, Deep Work, has had a big impact on me, because as a school teacher, most of the time your mental space is interrupted by thousands of interactions each day. And it's often quite difficult to find places where you can really focus and do deep, significant thinking and preparation. It's often eroded by all sorts of stuff. That's a really great book and brilliant. Now, he talks in this book about how he'd started to work on an entirely different piece of work, but then there was lots of need coming from people that knew him about how the smartphone revolution has really eroded something that was really important, and that's what this book's about. One of the ways that I usually absorb things and meditate and think through them is I create mind maps or infographics, and what I've done here is I've created one, and I'm just going to take you through it. So this video is really going through, it's going to be split into probably two parts. The first one, I just want to go through some of the main ideas that are in this book, because I think some of it is so helpful and it is definitely worth sharing. That's why I've produced this. And sometimes when you've got a graphic, it needs a bit of breaking down. That's what I find with my students. So I wanted to do something that I could share online. The second video, which will be a bit shorter, I'm going to talk a little bit about the specific digital tools that I use and a bit about my process. So those of you who go to the process page on my website, psalmvisual.com, you will see that there are lots of posts like this where I think it's useful sometimes to lift the bonnet up and look at the running of the engine underneath the car. So you don't just have a piece of artwork, you see how I arrived at it and what my thinking was. I think that's often really helpful. So let's talk a little bit about this book. Now, I've done a screen capture here, so I'm going to split between back and forth on that on my iPad. So I'm going to take you through some of the bits here. This on my iPad is a Clip Studio Paint document. This is how I like to keep it with, on the left hand side, there's lots of shortcut keys that you can access quite easily. This document has several items to it. So what you see here is a photograph of a piece of magic whiteboard paper that I have stuck to one of my walls. This is often how I'll work in the early stages. Working with a whiteboard pen is a very natural thing because I work as a school teacher, and it often means you can think quickly and erase things with your finger, and because it's sort of physical and it's in front of you, there's something a bit more freeing. Anyway, that's a photograph that I took, and the book, so if I just go here, let's have a look. Here are my initial notes that I took from the book, and this is a sign of a really well written book because he splits it immediately into practices and foundations. So that gave me a bit of an idea of how I was going to split it. I thought, let's have a thing where you have the foundations at the bottom and then practices at the top. So that's basically how this thing works. Let's go back to this document. So that's what I did. I produced a thing which split it into its constituent parts. From there, I then took I brought the opacity down on here. Actually, I'm kind of doing a process thing here now. And I went into, so this is using a pencil tool within Clip Studio Paint, which is a beautiful drafting tool. Using that and the lasso and manipulation items on here, it was a really helpful way of breaking this down. I then broke it down further into different parts. From there, I then inked it using a particular pen. Now, if you notice, the pen that we've got here is in fact, and this is really weird to Clip Studio Paint, but this is in fact vector. Although it looks like it's an analog pen, it just means that it's infinitely scalable. Now, this works very differently to Affinity Designer and Adobe Illustrator, which are very similar kinds of apps. They have some different strength each. This doesn't export to scalable vector format scalable vector graphic file formats. It's just within Clip Studio Paint, but it's worth taking it because you can do lots of interesting stuff with it as long as you're happy with working inside that. So that's a sort of an inking stage there. Now from there you'll notice that I then took it to a further stage, which this is the final stage. This is within Clip Studio, this is within Affinity Designer. So Affinity Photo, Affinity Designer and Affinity Publisher are a trio of apps that are really worth having. If you run a Mac and you have an iPad, the dance between those two is really, really brilliant, because what you can do is you can use the Apple Pencil to create pressure sensitive imagery in the way you might use a Wacom tablet, and then send that back to the Mac and do much more careful, detailed tweaking of things, because the input and the control is a lot greater there for those sorts of operations, and then bring it back and work between the two. And that's basically what I've done. This image represents about 4 or 5 steps back and forth between my iPad and my Mac. So now what I'm going to do is I just want to talk through some of the ideas that are in this document, because I think that's probably really helpful. And people who are watching this will probably be not interested to know how I use my Apple Pencil. So I'm just going to go into this. So essentially, it's by Cal Newport. I suggest that you read the book, get it for yourself. But let's go through it quickly. It splits into 2 sections, foundations and practices. I'm just going to deal with foundations first of all. The foundation section has 3 main chunks to it. The first part talks about how iPhones, or particularly smartphone, the smartphone revolution has gone from being something that combined the original iPod with a phone to something that's much more similar to the kind of dark patterns. That's a little link there to Harry Brignall. A little link to the sort of dark patterns that you might see employed in casinos, where people essentially have designed it so that it traps you in to addictive forms of behaviour. And he talks about 2 factors that encourage behavioural addiction. And these would be something called intermittent positive reinforcement, where a bit like a slot machine, where it's not predictable when you're going to win, and as a result of that, when you do win or you get some likes back or something of value, it has much more of a dopamine rush, or there's much more excitement. And the fact that it's not reliable in that way really leads you to keep coming back for more and more, and the risk that maybe something is going to pay off in your smartphone interaction. And he says that there are subtle designs that are used, and he refers to a whistleblower whose name I can't remember, but it's in that chapter, who talks about how at Google this sort of stuff was going on. And you see this throughout all of the big tech companies. And then let's face it, social approval, so how people think of you. I mean, that's the massive reinforcer of certain behaviour, isn't it? Whether it's a true or false expression of what you really think, what people think of you is huge. So social approval. And then this section really ends with this amazing bit where Bill Mayer is talking to this chap, and it gets to this point where he's saying, look, checking your likes is the new form of smoking. And it links back to the Jeffrey Wigand story, which is featured in, I think it's Michael Mann's Insider, which is such a brilliant film. And I remember watching that in the 90s about how someone whistle blew on the tobacco industry in America, and basically they designed into cigarettes a form of addiction where there was a certain release, an addictive release. And they said, look, we knew this for decades, that tobacco is really addictive, and they're selling you something that's just going to tie you into a form of slavery. And he's saying, well, look, there's something going on here with smartphones and the whole smartphone social media culture, in that as we check our likes, it's a form of addiction and we're being drawn into it. It's a great bit. There are some other bits to this, but you'll need to read that to get that yourself. But there's lots of good stuff in there. So he calls it the lopsided arms race. He moves on from there to talk about digital minimalism itself, and he says that there are at least 3 guiding ideas. So he says that it's quite easy to go online and to find 12 steps for digital detox, or these sorts of knee-jerk things where someone suddenly gets really fed up with their phone, so they throw it away, or they get a dumb phone, or they suddenly live off the grid for 12 years in Scotland or wherever it is. I know Scotland is very wide, but there are little islands where it isn't. Or maybe going and live in Bognor Regis, no offence. And what he does in this section is he talks about how important it is to have a philosophy or guiding ideas. And he says he gives us at least three, which are really good ones. He talks about the idea of clutter being costly. So where there's all these tiny incremental claims on our time or our attention, and it ends up, so this kind of parallels back to the stuff on deep work, where there's lots of things chipping away, and the result of it is that you don't actually achieve anything great at all. And he talks about how that's quite an important principle. Then he talks about the idea of optimization. So there is a sort of a peak point where you focus on a certain number of things, but then beyond that it starts to become counterproductive. You'll need to have a look at that. I'm not explaining it very well. I'm most proud of this little bit. This is the idea that I came up with last night. I had a different image in mind, but this I thought was lovely. He refers to how the Amish community, who are often referred to as, people often think of them as a sort of a backwards kind of Christian cult almost, living in America where they reject technology. Actually, people that look and know about their culture say, do you know what, if you look at how they actually use technology in their communities, they have an intentionality about it. So here I've got like this Jenga block, and one particular piece has been pulled out, and that's rather like the example that's used of the Amish, that they don't just use everything or reject everything. They pick and choose, and they're very careful about what they choose. Now this is lovely because these three principles, if you can grab hold of them and help that to guide you with how you think about your use of digital technology, it's actually very freeing, because we have a sort of all or nothing thing, and that tsunami of digitalia is just too much, whereas this actually helps you cut through it. And I had so many different thoughts as I went through that. The third section on this he refers to as the digital declutter, and he talks about three ideas, which are these. He talks about the idea of a 30-day break, and what I love particularly about this is it's a very nuanced section. He doesn't just simply say throw everything out and then that's it, because what often happens is when you do that, you throw everything out and then you go all the way back in, and it's just too much and it's too chaotic, and it's also not that thoughtful. Instead, ask questions about which technology you're taking a break from. Don't confuse the idea of convenience with what's critical. And I love this bit about having an operating procedure. So there's an example in the book of how someone, instead of getting rid of Netflix entirely, they would only watch Netflix if it was a social setting or they were with other people. So rather than binge watching a whole series, you would just watch it when you're with other people, which actually is a really great response to trying to break something down or declutter. In that 30 days, instead of just simply sitting there on your own on your bed and just looking out the window and feeling sad about your life because you've no longer got Twitter or whatever it is, it talks about exploring other things, because you're not just simply getting rid of something, you're creating a space where you can explore really great ideas. So here I've got a little spaceman, and asking yourself, is it a meaningful, is it a satisfying thing? Find things to do. Now, later in the book with practices, he talks about what those things might be, and I'll get onto that in a moment. And then after the 30 days, he talks about reintroducing. So you going back to the technology and gradually, bit by bit, reintroducing them. But as you do, asking yourself questions of, does this fit with my values? Is this the best use of my time? And when am I going to do it, and how am I going to do it? It's that kind of thing where you've separated yourself out, and then you're coming back slowly and you're reevaluating it. And because you have that 30-day distance, you're actually able to ask hard questions about whether it's actually genuinely useful. I love this bit because there's something really sensible, and it feels like a long-term, careful way of doing it. An example actually that's in the book is how someone came back, and when they started to go back through a particular social media account, they said to themselves, what did I see in this? And the fact that they just had a gap at a time away help them to reevaluate. Now, it might be in that time you discover running, or you discover some sort of craft activity. We'll get into that in a few moments, but I love that. So it's really brilliant. So they're the foundations. Then he moves up to talking about practices, and there's lots of detail here, but I'll try and do it fairly quickly. So we'll deal with the first bit, which is about spending time alone. And he brings up the concept of solitude deprivation, which is where you would have zero, and he talks about what solitude is. It's not necessarily sitting in a mountain on your own looking for the golden belly button. It's actually being free from the input of other minds. So you could be sat, as I often am, in a very public place with lots of people around me, but I might have sound cancelling headphones on, or I might be zoned out. That can be solitude. It doesn't have to mean being physically separate, but it does mean that your mind is kind of clear to just have its own thoughts. So no time with your own thoughts. And he talks about how the primary enabler of solitude deprivation is in fact the smartphone. So here are some of the practicalities that he mentions. He says things like leaving your phone at home or going off grid for particular amounts of time. For me particularly, one of the things I've done is I've actually got rid of my Apple Watch, and I bought this £13 watch which no longer connects me to it. And I'd got used to having certain notifications. I was very careful how I used it, and I used it mainly for running. But I basically in the end decided, actually, do you know what? I don't actually need to be told all the time, and having gaps. So that might be one way. That's one way that I've personally found it's useful. And in terms of my running, I actually figured out other ways of doing what I was getting from the Apple Watch. He talks about the idea of walks. That's like a real natural way of breaking and creating solitude. It's an amazing way of doing it, and maybe doing it without headphones, which is what often people do. He talks about the idea of writing yourself reflective letters. Some of that may or may not be applicable to you, but you can look at that in the book. He goes into a lot more detail with that. The second section on practices, he talks about the idea of don't click like. And he brings up a book by Shelley Turkle, I think her name is. I've got that on my shelf. I'm about halfway through that. And it reminded me to go back over it, where she refers to the difference between low and high bandwidth interactions. So you have something where someone has a connection. So, for example, you might follow someone on Twitter or Instagram and they have a similar interest to you. That's a connection. But conversation is much more of a high bandwidth thing. And here I've tried to illustrate it with these sort of squiggly lines. The natural connection and interplay between real people who are much more intimately connected. This is one of the frustrations with Zoom, by the way, because there's that weird gap where you have to allow someone to speak or have the space. And it's much slower than a normal conversation. It's still quite good, but it's not great. And he talks in here about conversation-centric communication. Now, that could be with digital tools, as Zoom and that kind of thing does facilitate, and that's why it's been so popular. But it's about prioritising the things where that richness is there. And clicking like is a substitute for it. So he's saying, there's one quote in the book which is something along the lines of, clicking like being a substitute for having coffee with a friend. There's no substitute there, but that's what we've done. We've gone down that line where just simply clicking on something is the way that you'd substitute it. And there's a thing online where a thing that he refers to where he talks about someone is saying, well, can't you, when you have a lot of these online sips, does it add up to a big gulp of conversation? And to which the person says, no, it doesn't. You can't substitute that. And one of the practicalities here is talking about the idea of being present more. In other words, it's almost like what's going on here, Cal Newport, is he's saying we've edged into this substitute for genuine conversation and genuine interaction and sociability. And what he's saying is actually what we should do is push those things apart. So minimise the sort of clicking the like substitute thing and maximise the things which involve much more social interaction, eye contact, that kind of stuff, right? And here's some of the other practical things he talks about. He talks about upgrading relationships, so where you would invest more in going for a walk with someone or spending time where you would actually have a proper interactive conversation rather than a one-way click, oh, I've acknowledged you online, that kind of stuff. Consolidating text is something particular. I'm not sure if I personally found that helpful, but the idea that you would... do you know what? You just read it yourself. I'm just saying too much here. Let's go to the third thing. We're almost done. He talks about the idea of reclaiming leisure, and here he links it to the idea of something called high-quality leisure. So I've put that together in that. That's not actually Cal Newport's title. But reclaiming high-quality leisure is the sort of essence of it. And there's three things here. He talks about three features. So let's start with this one. he talks about prioritising demanding activity over passive consumption. Now, at the end of a teaching day, I am usually so flaked out, I just want to sit there and watch something, and that's often how we function in our house. But actually, there is something about stepping out and doing a run or something that's a bit more demanding, a bit more difficult. And it doesn't feel like an easy journey to make, but still, if you're able to make it, there's something very rewarding and very helpful about it. And I love that about high quality leisure, that's something that's more demanding. And that doesn't necessarily have to be physical, but still, there you go. He talks about the idea of using your skills to make valuable things. And there's this absolutely lovely bit in the book where he talks about how you have people who've lost the ability to make stuff. So he gives an example of someone making a bench, right? Woodworking skills, varnishing, whatever, thinking about the design of how someone sits, all that kind of thing. And there's this bench that you can sit on, and it's something that's physical, it's in the real world, it's valuable, it's doing something. But what he then talks about is people who don't have that. So what they're doing is they're going to a hipster cafe and they're taking an Instagram photo with a filter attached. And what they're doing is they're looking for people to like this amazing effort that they've made. They've made a picture of a visit they did to a cafe. And there's no comparison. It's not really... I mean, by all means, take a photo in your cafe and send it up to Instagram for likes. But why not make something? Why not think about, learn about sewing or take a dance class or do something that's, if it is digital, so I'm trying to do this by producing this infographic, if it is something digital, but make something that's useful, rather than just sort of do this narcissistic gaze into the world where you're just saying, here's what I can see, and that's kind of the extent of what you're producing. It's just like, it's not great. There's a place for it, but it's not great. I mean, you take my point. And then he talks about supercharged sociality. And that leads to some of the practical things. So there's a reference to someone, I can't remember who it is again. That's how well I've absorbed this. And I have absorbed it pretty well. The idea of joining something. Are there clubs? Are there particular things you can participate in? I think that was it for the practical things. But I love that. That really made me think about what I'm doing. Yeah. Oh yeah, that's it. Here's some of the other bits. Talks about having leisure plans. And he splits those into seasonal and weekly. I mean, this was a bit too much for me. But certainly having a plan where you think, what leisure activities am I going to be involved in? The idea of fixing things, which I really took that to heart. So I tend to hide away from practical things. I'm not great at DIY. I've never been interested in it. But the idea that our house has got lots of things which probably need fixing. So there's a light in our kitchen that's not quite fixed. That I've made a list on my wall of things I'm going to fix. And he talks about doing one thing a week or a day. So you don't have this massive, every 5 years you do this massive project, but it's like you have little things that you're doing, and that's a good way of expressing yourself with leisure plans. And I love this as well, embrace slow media. So reading is obviously one of those examples, but we've reduced everything down to quick bits of reading and quick online interactions, whereas actually, what about taking your time over something? These are things that we all know about, but I love how he's put them together. And the book ends with this thing. It's a kind of call to action, and he talks about the idea of join the attention resistance. So it's almost like there's a Goliath 2.0 and there's David, and it's like the smartphone culture, and it's saying, we dominate you. We're using all these dark patterns to grab you in. And he's saying, look, let's join this resistance where we resist the culture. And some of the things might be deleting apps. So what about taking social media? So when you're on your phone, the default thing is that there are these things that you immediately go to. Actually, why not take them off so that you control where you have that? So there are certain things that I've now taken off of certain apps, certain gadgets, and they only appear on other places. So that's quite important. And one of the initial things about the iPad, one of the great things about it in the early days, people talked about it as being this sort of unifunctional device, that it couldn't multitask. Now obviously that's been built in a lot more now with iOS 13 going to 14 and forwards. People are trying to make it much more of a multitasking device. But there's nothing wrong with having a simple one-purpose device. Why not take something that's so amazingly built and reduce it back down to, yeah, this is for doing this. So anyway, there's lots of stuff that could be said about that. So yeah, so there you go, Cal Newport's Digital Minimalism. I hope some of that has been helpful. If it has, maybe I'm going to say that usual stuff. People always say this. They go, like and subscribe. Thank you, Adam Buxton, for that. But, why don't you leave a comment or a message? And there you go. I'm going to stop it there.